Hi, I'm Joe Graydon.
I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy, where we bring you the stories behind the health headlines.
This podcast is brought to you by Redix Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Body Cream. 800-345-7339, on the web at uttercream.com. Do you skip breakfast? What about lunch? Is skipping meals a good strategy for losing weight? What about fasting? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
We all recognize that what we eat matters for our health, including our heart health as well as our weight. But does it make any difference when we eat? What about snacks? Does snacking between meals or at night have an impact on our weight?
Dr. Marie-Pierre St-Onge has studied how skimping on sleep affects what we choose to eat while we're awake. What do you do when you're under stress? Many people turn to familiar comfort foods to get them through a crisis.
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, learn how meal timing affects our health.
First, this news.
In the People's Pharmacy health headlines, hormone replacement therapy does not appear to increase the risk of death from either heart disease or cancer. That's what researchers concluded by analyzing data from the long-running Women's Health Initiative study. In this double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, more than 27,000 women were randomized to receive estrogen plus progestin, estrogen alone, or placebo. After several years of treatment, researchers reported an increased incidence of breast cancer among women taking estrogen plus progestin. There were also more cardiovascular complications, but a new long-term analysis found no increased risk of death among women taking HRT during the 18-year follow-up analysis. The study, published in JAMA, should be reassuring to women who are suffering from severe symptoms of menopause, including hot flashes and night sweats. On the other hand, the authors note that it remains unclear whether the benefits of HRT would outweigh the risks if women took hormones for longer periods of time. The bottom line seems to be that taking HRT to ease menopausal symptoms and improve sleep for a few years does not seem to be associated with an increased risk of death.
For decades, breast cancer surgeons believed that removing all lymph nodes from the armpit area was essential for reducing the risk of recurrent breast cancer. But exactly how effective is this practice? A study designed to answer that question surprised many oncologists and surgeons. After more than 6 years of follow-up, there was no difference in mortality between stage 1 and 2 breast cancer patients who had full lymph node removal and those who did not. A new study of the 10-year overall survival rate also found no difference in survival between the two groups of women. An editorial in JAMA that accompanied the study concluded that, quote, less can be more in clinical medicine, meaning that providing fewer diagnostic tests or treatments may be just as good for patients as when very aggressive interventions are pursued.
New cancer drugs have become extremely expensive. It's not unusual for immunotherapy treatments to cost between $100,000 and $200,000 a year. The argument that's frequently used to justify such high prices is the cost of research and development. One frequently cited analysis lists the cost to bring a new drug to market at $2.7 billion. Now, a new analysis published in JAMA Internal Medicine challenges that estimate. The researchers calculated the total R&D spending from the first year of a cancer drug's development up to FDA approval. Instead of nearly $3 billion a drug, the authors suggested that the median cost would be closer to $648 million. They conclude that in a short period, development cost is more than recouped, and some companies boast more than a tenfold higher revenue than R&D spending, a sum not seen in other sectors of the economy.
If you want to stay healthy, don't just sit there. A new study of approximately 8,000 people shows that getting up and moving around every half hour or so is better for health than sitting still. In this study, the subjects wore activity monitors all day long for a week, so the investigators got a good idea of their activity patterns. Then they tracked what happened to their subjects over the next 4 years. During that time, 340 of these people died, and it turns out that those who sat still for the longest periods of time were more likely to be among them. The researchers conclude that sitting really is the new smoking. To diminish the risks, they suggest that sitters get up and stretch or walk around every half hour or so.
Less dreaming may mean more dementia. Australian researchers conducted in-depth all-night sleep studies on 321 older individuals. None had cognitive problems when the study began. After 12 years, however, 10% were diagnosed with dementia. Those who developed dementia had spent less of their sleep time during the study night in REM sleep. Such rapid eye movement sleep is an indicator of dreaming. It's not clear, though, whether increasing time spent in REM could conserve cognitive function. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Most people plan to eat 3 meals a day, but sometimes things don't work out as you planned. Instead, if you're running late, you may skip breakfast. If you're on a tight deadline, you may work through lunch. In such cases, do you end up snacking throughout the day? Is it a donut at mid-morning along with a cup of coffee? Do you find yourself reaching for cheese crackers or M&Ms in the middle of the afternoon? What about a bowl of popcorn or ice cream at night while watching television before bed? How does the timing of your meals and snacks affect your health?
To find out, we turn to Dr. Marie-Pierre Saint-Onge. She's Associate Professor of Nutritional Medicine in the Department of Medicine at Columbia University Medical Center. She's also on faculty of the New York Obesity Nutrition Research Center and the Institute of Human Nutrition in the College of Physicians and Surgeons at Columbia University.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Saint-Onge.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here.
Dr. Saint-Onge, we were fascinated to see that you have chaired a committee for the American Heart Association that published in January a summary of pretty much what is known about meal timing and frequency and how it affects our risk of heart disease. So we'd like to start by asking you how meal timing and frequency has changed for Americans over the last few decades.
Right. So we no longer really eat 3 square meals a day. It seems that Americans are now really eating around the clock, and there's very few hours during the day where people are not reporting eating. So it's very important to assess how this influences cardiovascular disease risk as well as obesity risk.
Well, I wonder if you can walk us through it just a little bit. How does the fact that we're eating all the time actually affect our heart disease risk?
Mm-hmm. So we know that our body has various hormones, and our hormones have their own cycles and rhythms, and they are optimally active at different times of day. So if there's intake of foods, intake of nutrients at times when these hormones are not really ready to be in contact with these nutrients, then they're not handled in the appropriate fashion. So for example, we are much more insulin resistant in the evening. So that means that our body cannot process carbohydrates, sugars as well in the late evening as it can during earlier hours in the day. So if the bulk of our food intake is later in the day, that can, for some people, create some problems.
So that would suggest eating a bowl of ice cream while watching television at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock at night might not be such a good plan.
It might not be such a good plan for various reasons. But yes, and not everybody has the same risk. Everybody has different genetic makeup, and that also influences how they will respond to various nutrient exposure at different times. But in general, yes, eating later in the day, having this late night bowl of ice cream would not be something that would be recommendable for heart health.
I'd like to ask about breakfast because I think breakfast habits have changed pretty dramatically over the last 50 years. When I was growing up, it wasn't unusual to have a pretty hearty breakfast, a pretty fatty breakfast. It might include eggs, for example. But then we were told eggs were bad, and a lot of kids would go off to school with breakfast cereal instead. And along came pretty sugary breakfasts. Fruit Loops with marshmallows, Kellogg's s'mores,
Pop-Tarts.
honey snacks. And that might be all that child would have for breakfast, except maybe a glass of orange juice. I'm curious about how that might have affected metabolism.
Well, there's a lot in that question, actually. So first is the concept of having breakfast versus not having breakfast, and then also the composition of that breakfast, if it's higher in protein versus higher in carbohydrates, and also then the type of carbohydrates that's being consumed. So if we start off with the premise of whether breakfast consumption is optimal for health, we have quite a bit of evidence from epidemiological studies. So those large-scale observational studies that look at behaviors and various health indicators that show that people who do consume breakfast, whatever that is, have typically a lower weight status, so lower body mass index. They're typically have less obesity than people who don't have breakfast. They tend to have a lower risk of cardiovascular disease than people who don't have breakfast. But when we do intervention studies, asking people who usually skip breakfast to start eating breakfast, we don't see people lose weight. And those studies are not typically long enough to be able to see effects on cardiovascular disease, but typically there's not much in terms of risk factors that changes with starting to consume breakfast if you're not a typical breakfast consumer.
So it might be perhaps that the people who normally eat breakfast and are a little lower in weight, maybe there's a lot of other things that are different about them as well.
Absolutely. So people who typically have breakfast, they usually have greater physical activity. They usually have a better diet profile, a better diet pattern in general. They're more physically active, tend to smoke less, and have less of other risk factors as well. Now, breakfast types have also been studied in various forms. If we are looking at breakfast cereal, if we look at healthier types of breakfast cereal, so higher in fiber, those types of cereal tend to have a better impact on health than the sugary types that you're talking about. And then the question about eggs, we're no longer so concerned about egg consumption, right, than we used to be. And we now know that dietary cholesterol is not as much of a risk factor for heart disease as circulating levels of cholesterol. And those two, dietary and circulating levels of cholesterol, are not necessarily very strongly related.
We had a friend in graduate school who basically skipped breakfast, would show up at his first class of the day, maybe at 9 or 10 o'clock, and his breakfast was a Hershey chocolate bar and a can of Coca-Cola. Mm-hmm. And that was his idea of the way to start the day, every day.
I was shocked, I must say. I was shocked.
A sugar caffeine rush, right?
Exactly.
A crash waiting to happen in a few hours.
Well, I knew I wouldn't be able to do that.
But I'm curious, what actually happens metabolically when you have that kind of breakfast?
Well, your blood sugar goes up very quickly. For healthy individuals, that's usually being taken care of, and your blood glucose normalizes very well. In people who have overweight and obesity and are starting to become glucose intolerant or insulin resistant, then the sugar levels remain elevated a little longer, and that can have quite negative health effects.
As far as we know, our friend did not have any negative health effects because he was normal body weight and is still alive and healthy all these many years later. I don't know if he's still eating Coke and chocolate for breakfast.
Right, and this was in childhood years too, so perhaps his behavior has changed over the years into a more reasonable eating pattern, hopefully.
It might indeed. Now, are there other risk factors that meal frequency and meal timing are connected to?
So we look at obesity risk as one of the risk factors for cardiovascular disease, and we assessed the impact of different meal frequency schedules as well as timing of meals, and that's also a quite interesting field of study where higher frequency of eating occasions tends to have a beneficial impact for cardiovascular health, but that's in the context of maintaining energy or weight maintenance, right? So if we provide a full day's worth of calories over equally spaced meals more frequently during the day, that tends to create a more stable glucose pattern and tends to have good metabolic effects, so have health benefits. Now, we don't have much information about what happens if we start recommending people to eat more frequently, because we know that some people may not be able to stop eating very well once they start, and every eating occasion then becomes an additional occasion to overeat. So if you start advising people to have 6 eating occasions instead of 3 or 4, then one would start to worry about potentially weight gain with additional meal occasions. But in very strictly controlled studies, for equal caloric intake over a period of time, more frequent meals is good. There's also the opposite that's also been shown to have benefits. So alternate day fasting is another type of dietary pattern that's been assessed for weight management. So that means that participants would not eat or eat very little, about 25% of their energy requirements on one day. And then the next day, they eat as much as they like. And they can have these fasting days 2 to 3 times a week or every other day. And that has shown to have beneficial impact for weight loss as well as cardiovascular disease risk.
You're listening to Dr. Marie-Pierre Saint-Onge, Associate Professor of Nutritional Medicine in the Department of Medicine at the New York Obesity Nutrition Research Center. She's part of the Institute of Human Nutrition in the College of Physicians and Surgeons at Columbia University.
Isn't that interesting that fasting actually does seem to help people lose weight? And you don't have to, completely give up food during that day, just cutting back a little bit.
Right.
After the break, we're going to find out more about fasting.
How does time-restricted feeding affect laboratory animals? And would it have the same effect on us?
Are there health benefits to losing even a small amount of weight?
We'll talk about the connections between stress and emotional eating.
You'll learn about the link between sugar consumption and fatty liver.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
If you like the information you hear when you listen to The People's Pharmacy, you may also enjoy our book published by National Geographic. It's The People's Pharmacy Quick and Handy Home Remedies, available online at peoplespharmacy.com or at your favorite bookstore.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Redix Industries, makers of utterly smooth creams and lotions that deeply moisturize to make dry skin feel soft and smooth. 800-345-7339. The website is uttercream.com.
If you would like to purchase a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. This is show number 1094. That number again, 800-732-2334, or you can find it online, peoplespharmacy.com.
A study in the Journal of Nutrition found that people who eat just 1 or 2 meals a day have a lower body mass index than those who eat 3 meals a day, while those who snack frequently have a higher BMI. Those who ate their largest meal at breakfast had a lower BMI than those who ate big dinners.
We're talking today about how meal timing affects our health. Our guest is Dr. Marie-Pierre Saint-Onge, Associate Professor of Nutritional Medicine at Columbia University Medical Center and the New York Obesity Nutrition Research Center. She's on the faculty of the Institute of Human Nutrition of the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Columbia University.
Dr. Saint-Onge, I'd like to talk a little more about fasting because it's had a checkered history where some food experts have said that's a terrible idea, and other people have said, no, this is really great. It really works. It's good for you. And I kind of would like to get your sense of what's realistic. What could people do that's not too unpleasant and have an impact on their body weight? So if you were interacting with people who said, I want to lose about 10 or 15 pounds, how would they incorporate that concept?
Okay, so that actually is a very, I think, personalized recommendation. For some people who are able to not eat for extended periods of time, that may be a very good opportunity to cut their caloric intake. So, for example, if someone has a hard time reducing their caloric intake and maintaining a lower intake level long term, but could say, you know what, I can just have lunch in a day, just have lunch and do that 3 times a week, no problem. Then that might be a good way to achieve the same amount of energy reduction as constantly being on a lower energy diet. So, for example, there was a paper that just came out about a month ago, or even more recent than that, that compared 2 different types of weight loss programs. One in which one group was asked to reduce their caloric intake by 500 calories every day and maintain that lower energy level throughout the study. The other group was told, on one day, you can only have a 500-calorie lunch, and then the following day, you can eat as much as you like, and then you do that alternating over time, over the same period of time. What ended up happening is that both groups restricted to the same extent, and both groups lost the same amount of weight. So the people who were asked to only eat 500 calories on their fast days were not quite able to reach 500 calories, but on their day where they could eat as much as they wanted, they didn't compensate as much. And what ended up happening is, overall, on average, they also ended up cutting about 500 calories a day. So it just depends on a person's preferences and what can be sustained long term.
We interviewed a guest not too long ago who said she lost weight by stopping eating after 3 o'clock in the afternoon and just never consumed any calories post 3 p.m., and that helped a lot.
Until the following morning when she would eat around 8 or 9 o'clock. So it was a long fasting period, and she said this was the only way she could actually maintain her weight.
Yeah, that's another option. So there's quite a bit of variations on that theme. That we actually don't call fasting, but we called time-restricted feeding. So you only restrict your food intake for a specific period of time during the day. Sometimes some recommendations are you can only eat over an 8-hour window or a 10-hour window. And then all of your calories should be consumed within that window, and then the rest of the time you're not eating. So some people could pick when their window is and make it more amenable to their lifestyle, but that's when they're restricted. So it's the same as the concept of a closed kitchen after a certain hour. That could be very beneficial for some people.
Is it better to restrict calories in the afternoon, evening, or in the morning? Because there are a lot of people who say, I just skip breakfast and lunch and then I eat, dinner.
Right. Well, that's what we were talking about earlier, about the breakfast skippers. What observational studies seem to tell us is that those people who skip breakfast don't have a better cardiovascular risk profile than people who eat breakfast. So my advice would be to restrict intake later in the day and maintain food intake during the day when you're more active and you really need the energy to be able to focus and function and have your daily activities.
We've been talking about people who want to lose a modest amount of weight, maybe 10 or 15 pounds. Some people need to lose more than that. But are there health benefits to losing just a modest amount of weight?
We see health benefits to losing as little as 5% of your body weight. So absolutely.
And can you tell us what those benefits are?
Always benefits on glucose tolerance, so reduced risk of diabetes, improvements in blood pressure, improvements in the lipid profile, inflammatory markers. So those are all sorts of metabolic improvements that can be seen with mild weight loss.
Dr. St. Ange, one of the things that trips a lot of us up is we get under stress and we start eating, or we feel depressed and we have a hot fudge sundae, or there's some other type of emotional challenge that comes along and we head for the refrigerator. Why do people tend to do this, and is there anything we can do about it?
So I think there are two types of people. Those who eat under stress and those who cannot eat under stress. So for some people, they get so stressed, their stomach tightens up and they just can't eat. And for others, eating is comforting and will have much reward, and that's where they go to. The advice there would be to try to have some other compensatory behavior that you can use under periods of stress. So perhaps instead of going for the refrigerator, going for a walk or doing a yoga session, relaxation, anything that, would get your mind off your stressor and food.
There are some offices where there are candy bowls, lots of candy and cookies and all kinds of other sweet treats. And, those are offices where there's oftentimes a lot of pressure and deadlines. And, when people are feeling under pressure, they head for that candy bowl. How do we kind of avoid that temptation, if at all possible, when it's just sitting right out there calling to us?
Hide it.
Well, that's a good start, isn't it?
Absolutely. Talk to your colleagues and just mention how unhealthy that is, and try to enlist the help of your colleagues to work with you in helping you achieve better behaviors and making it perhaps an office goal to eat better and have a better lifestyle.
Well, this brings up the whole question of sugar, because there was a time not too long ago when we didn't think sugar was that big a deal. In fact, I remember interviewing a diabetologist, one of the country's leading diabetes experts, who said, no, sugar does not contribute to diabetes. But now we've heard a lot about sugar and processed carbs having an impact on blood sugar and insulin and, just general metabolic bad news. And we've been told that we really, really, really need to cut back on sugar. And this thing called fatty liver, which I hope you can explain, has actually been found in younger people who consume large amounts of sugar. And why would that be a problem?
So usually higher carbohydrates, simple carbohydrate intakes leads to higher triglycerides. So that's one type of fat that's in the blood. And then when we have more fat in the blood, it tends to deposit in various tissues. Ideally, fat would get deposited into adipose tissue. so you get more fat. But in some cases, when adipose tissue no longer accepts fat deposit, you also start to deposit fat elsewhere where it's not supposed to go. So that includes the liver, that includes the muscles, the heart, several tissues of the body where it's not supposed to go. So when you're talking about fatty liver, that's when the liver starts to accumulate fat, and that's what we call ectopic fat, and that's not something you want to have happen.
No, it sounds unhealthy.
It absolutely is unhealthy. It could lead to liver diseases, cirrhosis, potentially cancer. It really has negative health effects.
So we want to try to avoid eating so much sugar that we end up with fatty liver. So that's one of the good reasons to pay attention to the quality of what we're eating.
Absolutely. So the recommendations were originally to reduce fat, and I think that had quite a negative effect because it led to the food industry responding by providing much more low-fat options. But then you want to make that food acceptable and palatable to people, and then the fat became replaced by sugar. And if you just walk down the aisles of the grocery stores and you look at full-fat versus low-fat versions of different foods. So, for example, one thing that I had looked at was cookies. So you look at the full-fat cookie, low-fat cookie, the calorie difference is very little, maybe 10 calories for one cookie. So if you're taking off 3-4 grams of fat, which would be about 30-40 calories, but the end result is only a 10-calorie difference, that means that those calories were something else was added in to make up for that difference in calories. And typically it's sugar and processed simple sugar, not complex carbohydrates. And that's what happens. I think what the recommendations now are more liberal on the fat side, and emphasize healthier fats and complex carbohydrates, which is, I think, a much more reasonable approach.
Let's talk a little bit about fat, because there is very little that's more controversial in the world of nutrition and your field than fat. Because not only have we been told that fat's bad for us, we've been specifically told there are certain fats that are really the enemy and other fats that are good. So for a long time we were told butter was bad, margarine was good, even with all those trans fats in them. Then we were told, no, trans fats are bad, and so are saturated fats, so skip the butter. But it's okay to have olive oil and peanut oil and all of the other polyunsaturated oils. And now we are hearing that, well, maybe it's okay to have some saturated fats, like coconut oil, for example, is not so terrible anymore. And oh, by the way, have all the nuts you want.
Mm-hmm. So the nuts are high in polyunsaturated fats and monounsaturated fats. So those are good. The avocados are the same thing, right? They're high fat food that people were originally told to avoid, but have good healthy fats. So I think fat is complicated because there's so many different kinds. There's the saturated, unsaturated. The unsaturated can be broken down into monounsaturated and polyunsaturated. Even the saturated fat can be subdivided into short, medium, long saturated fats, and they also have different health effects. So I think this is why some of the confusion happens. A lot of the early research also assessed individual fatty acids, but people don't eat individual fatty acids, so they eat complex foods.
Right. We
and
eat
that's why
meals, actually, that have lots of different foods in them usually. So that makes it all the more complicated if you're just focusing on one type of fat.
Exactly. And I think that's why the butter goes in and out in terms of being good and bad. But definitely on the trans fat, it's very clear that industrial trans fats are bad for us. And then the saturated fats, I think it depends which food they're in. Dairy, Saturated fats tend to show to have less of a negative health effect. In terms of coconut oil, the research is mostly because of the medium chain saturated fats, but I think that coconut oil needs further study. There's really very little research on coconut oil to be able to say that it's a healthy fat.
Is there a consensus among your colleagues as to what sorts of things we should be eating to stay healthy, in particular for cardiovascular health?
For sure, liquid vegetable oils. So those that don't become solid at room temperature. So those are healthy fats. Complex carbohydrates, whole grains, higher fiber. Always fruits and vegetables, nuts have shown much benefit for cardiovascular disease risk.
It sounds like you might be describing a Mediterranean diet.
Very, very close to it, yes.
Well, what is a Mediterranean diet? Because, there are a lot of countries around the Mediterranean, and Americans sort of have a very simplistic approach because there are people in the Mediterranean area who are, in fact, eating a lot of saturated fat. They're eating lamb, for example, and they're eating, full-fat dairy products. So help me understand, what is a Mediterranean diet?
Well, there exists a Mediterranean diet pyramid, right? Similar to the U.S. guidelines when we had a pyramid and now it's my plate. But there is such a thing as a Mediterranean diet pyramid where actually physical activity and is included at the base of that pyramid, so the larger portion, with complex grains, whole grains at the bottom of the pyramid, with a lot of fruits and vegetables at the bottom of the pyramid. And then as you move up, we start to limit some foods. So nuts should be consumed on a regular basis, fish several times a week, lean poultry several times a week, but then red meats limited to once or twice a week or less frequently, dairy a few times a week to daily. Red wine is on that pyramid, and olive oil.
You're listening to Dr. Marie-Pierre Saint-Onge, Associate Professor of Nutritional Medicine at Columbia University Medical Center and the New York Obesity Nutrition Research Center. She's also on the faculty of the Institute of Human Nutrition of the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Columbia University.
We keep hearing that olive oil is the good oil.
We do.
And along with those nuts. After the break, we're going to learn about the relationship between sleep and food intake.
Why do people tend to overeat when they don't get enough sleep?
Does inadequate sleep change people's food preferences?
If so, this could have implications for shift workers. What can they do to avoid dietary sabotage?
We'll also find out about functional foods, including green tea and chocolate.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. If you value the health information you get when you listen to The People's Pharmacy, consider subscribing to our email newsletter. You'll get the latest health news and information on upcoming podcasts delivered to your inbox twice a week. Look for the link at peoplespharmacy.com.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Red X Industries, makers of utterly smooth foot cream with shea butter, helping dry, cracked feet feel utterly soft and smooth. 800-345-7339. Online at uttercream.com.
To purchase a CD of today's show or any People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1094. That number again, 800-732-2334. Online at peoplespharmacy.com. You can also download the free podcast from iTunes or from our web store. We invite you to consider writing a review.
Today we're talking about the importance not only of what we eat, but also when we eat it. How does insomnia affect our eating behavior? Do people who have chronic sleep problems eat more or choose different foods?
Our guest is Dr. Marie-Pierre Saint-Onge. She is Associate Professor of Nutritional Medicine in the Department of Medicine at Columbia University Medical Center. She's also on faculty of the New York Obesity Nutrition Research Center and the Institute of Human Nutrition in the College of Physicians and Surgeons at Columbia University.
Dr. Saint-Onge, in addition to exercise, and we all know that exercise is absolutely essential for us to maintain a healthy life, and following a good, healthy diet, we've been talking about what constitutes a healthful diet. Another pillar of good health is sleep. And I know that you have actually studied, along with your colleagues, the role of sleep in controlling food intake. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about sleep. And, of course, Americans aren't sleeping as much now as they once did. We've talked about how diet patterns have changed, so have sleep patterns.
Absolutely. And it does seem counterintuitive that the most sedentary behavior of all may be associated with a lower risk of obesity and better cardiovascular health profile, right? But it absolutely is. We've done research to look at the impact of severe sleep restriction on food intake. And what we find is after a few nights of very, very short sleep, our participants overeat by approximately 300 calories compared to an equal period of time when they're allowed to sleep their habitual time.
Do we have any idea why?
So we have a lot of various clues. We look at hormones that affect appetite regulation. We've also looked at neuronal networks. We've been talking about reward and pleasure associated with food. Well, we've looked at that as well after sleep restriction. So there's studies that report higher levels of a hormone called ghrelin that stimulates appetite following periods of sleep restriction. We've also shown that in women, a hormone called glucagon-like peptide 1, which is involved in satiety, is reduced after a period of sleep restriction. So it seems, at least in our research, that men respond to sleep restriction with higher signaling for appetite, and women respond with reduced signaling for satiety. So men have more of a go signal, and women have less of a stop signal following sleep restriction. And when we look at neuronal responses to food stimuli, we see that when we show people pictures of foods in a functional magnetic resonance imaging scanner, their areas of the brain that are associated with pleasure and reward light up to a greater extent after sleep restriction compared to their habitual sleep.
We attended a graduation in which one of the school administrators got to talk to the graduate students and said to the parents of those students, "Don't you feed these people?" Because she said, I'm always supplying food to these starving students. But I'm also thinking that graduate students spend a lot of time working late at night on deadline, preparing papers and projects. And I'm wondering if that might also be affecting their appetite.
Oh, absolutely. So as I mentioned, when we measure food intake in a lab, people eat more when they're sleep restricted. And that's been shown in several other studies. That some studies have also shown weight gain after even 5 days, 1 kilogram weight gain with sleep restriction compared to habitual sleep. So there's definitely an impact of reduced sleep on food intake.
It sounds then as though chronic sleep deprivation might be contributing to the obesity epidemic. Is there anything to that?
Absolutely. Right now we have very short-term studies that provide evidence of a causal effect. We're working on longer-term studies to assess whether prolonged sleep restriction or short sleep duration can influence obesity risk and cardiovascular disease risk.
Does sleep restriction also affect the kinds of foods that people are drawn to in your experiments, do people have a choice of what they're going to eat once they wake up from a very short night?
Yes, they have a choice, and we measure that. We assess what they're eating. We find in our studies that they eat more fat and more saturated fat. In other studies, they find that people choose to eat more snack foods. They have higher intakes of simple sugars and simple carbohydrates. So it tends to be that after a period of sleep restriction, people will be drawn towards foods that are more energy dense, specifically higher in fat and sugar.
That sounds like it could be a recipe for weight gain.
Absolutely, people are not hitting the fruit cart after sleep restriction.
Now, let me ask you about the implications of that for the millions of people who work shifts.
Mm-hmm.
What can people do to counteract this tendency?
I think for people who work shift, it's important to plan and to be prepared, because the types of foods that are available when people are awake may not be the most healthy foods out there, and the availability of healthy foods may not be so readily available. So that's something that needs to be taken into consideration. I think that individuals should plan, maybe bring themselves a healthy snack from home, and make sure that they have something healthy on hand.
So if you're working overnight, the cafeteria might not be open, and what is available is the vending machine, not the best choice, right?
Absolutely.
Dr. St. Ange, you write about functional foods. And I think a lot of people are a little mystified by that concept. So if you could explain to us, what are functional foods and how do they impact on energy balance?
Okay, so the concept of functional foods is a food that may have added benefits above and beyond its nutrient content. So, for example, we've studied an oil that we called functional oil, where we had mixed different types of oils together along with plant sterols in a way to achieve increased energy expenditure following a meal, as well as improvements in the lipid profile. So that was our functional oil, a blend of various oils that together could have a benefit for weight management and cardiovascular disease risk.
How did it perform? The plant sterols, I assume, were lowering cholesterol?
Absolutely. So plant sterols, we also had flaxseed oil in that mix. We had medium-chain triglyceride oil, which tends to increase energy expenditure after the meal, so an increase in the thermic effect of the food, and could have benefits for weight management.
And did it help?
It helped, and in a controlled feeding study, it did have benefits on body composition in men. We also tested medium-chain triglyceride oil for its effects in a weight loss study, and it also improved weight loss when replacing other types of fats.
Now tell us, what is a medium-chain triglyceride oil or fat? Where would we look for that in the grocery store?
So this is where it loops back into the coconut oil business. Medium-chain triglyceride oil is a purified oil extracted from coconut oil. It's only made up of 2 fatty acids that have specific chain lengths of 8 and 10 carbons. So natural sources of those 2 fatty acids is coconut oil, palm kernel oil, butter. Those have some amounts of those medium-chain fatty acids. What we study is the purified form that contains only those 2 fatty acids. And they're metabolized very differently in the body. They're saturated fats, but because of their shorter chain length, they're not packaged in the same way as the longer chain fatty acids, and they travel directly to the liver. They don't travel through the peripheral circulation, so there's less potential for deposition into your adipose tissue. And once they get into the liver, they're burned off to a great extent. So burned off for energy, or they're elongated to be able to make other types of of products.
It sounds like that could be a big advantage, but are they commercially available? Can people just buy them if they want to add them to their diet for weight loss?
Oh, they are commercially available. They're quite expensive.
Okay.
What do you cook with?
I cook with different types of fats. I often have olive oil, mostly for salad dressings, but I also have corn oil, sometimes in stir fries, sesame oil in stir fries. I'm not afraid to use butter anymore, so I use that sometimes as well.
We've been talking about functional foods, and I've been fascinated by the way the FDA relates to functional foods. They get all excited. If you make a claim that a food does something for health, they kind of get outraged.
You have to be careful what you say about cherries or walnuts, right?
Right. And, that always fascinates me because what the FDA said is, well, if you make a claim for tart cherries, and there have actually been some interesting studies showing that cherry juice can actually have some health benefits, or if you talk about the heart benefits of walnuts, bad, shame on you. You're going to, we call that a drug, an unapproved drug.
And what about beet juice?
And beet juice and all kinds of other foods. So you have to be extremely careful not to offend the FDA. Could you give us some thoughts about, how functional foods might fit into a healthy diet above and beyond just, like you say, putting, olive oil on your salad?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are health claims that have been approved by the FDA. We currently have 12 health claims, and many of them are related to cardiovascular disease. So fruits and vegetables, nuts are included in as a health claim. There's a health claim on unsaturated fats, so different oils that have more than 80% of their fatty acids as unsaturated fats can make a health claim related to cardiovascular disease. So there's claims that can be made that have been approved relating different foods to better heart health.
People are always interested in something that they can drink or eat that will be the secret to weight loss that will not be too difficult. And one of the things that people like to imagine might help them lose weight is green tea. Do you know anything about the value or lack thereof of green tea for helping people maintain a good body weight?
So there's been studies about green tea extracts. Epigallocatechin gallate, EGCG, has been studied for weight management. There hasn't been that many more recent studies, but there definitely have been some studies to look at its effects for increasing energy expenditure. As I've mentioned, I think, if there are some different foods that can boost energy expenditure a little bit and kind of give you a little bit of a kickstart, that's actually quite nice and can be very helpful. So, in my opinion, the medium chain triglyceride oil could be one of those, potentially EGCG, but there's not much research about that, and I think there needs to be a little more research to be able to make definitive claims.
What about chocolate? we do like chocolate a lot on the People's Pharmacy. We talk about the health benefits, but I'm wondering, there's chocolate and then there's chocolate. What I mean by that is, there's milk chocolate that's very sugary versus dark chocolate that's really almost a little astringent.
Well, and just recently we saw epidemiology from Denmark that showed that people who eat chocolate more than once a month, and particularly people who ate it between 2 and 6 times a week, they had less likelihood of cardiovascular problems, heart attacks, and that sort of thing. This was a 14-year, more or less 14-year epidemiology follow-up. And of course, it's epidemiology. You can't say it's cause and effect. But what a delightful intervention for your heart health. Is there anything to that, do you suppose?
All right. Well, like you said, it's all about the quality and the type, right? So a lot of the chocolate that people see on the shelves are a mix of palm oil and sugar. and all sorts of different ingredients to reduce the bitterness and increase the sweetness of the pure cocoa. And a lot of the research that looks at the influence of cocoa really looks at the pure bitter cocoa and its flavanols and all other healthful components in there. So in my opinion, going for the purer forms, the darker forms, is always preferable to the more processed forms, and I think that's in everything we eat.
Dr. St. Ange, do you have any recommendations for us and our listeners so that we can follow a good, healthy lifestyle?
So we talked about diet, we talked about sleep, we talked about exercise. I think they're all quite interrelated. If we can have a good night's sleep, that may lead to a more healthful diet. More healthful diet may lead to better sleep, better activity level, better sleep and diet, and it kind of gets into a healthful cycle. So if we can break a vicious cycle and try to turn it around and make it more healthful with improvements in sleep that may make people adhere better to their diet and make healthier choices, then I think that's a big achievement.
Dr. Marie-Pierre St. Ange, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
You've been listening to Dr. Marie-Pierre St. Ange, Associate Professor of Nutritional Medicine at Columbia University Medical Center and the New York Obesity Nutrition Research Center. She's also on the faculty of the Institute of Human Nutrition of the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Columbia University.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wadarski is the engineer. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
The People's Pharmacy is made possible by Red X Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Extra Care 20 Cream with 20% urea for extra skin protection. 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
To buy a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1094. That number again, 800-732-2334. You can find it online at peoplespharmacy.com.
And when you visit our site, you can share your thoughts on today's show. Are you a breakfast skipper? How about snacks? What are your favorite snack foods? Share your story in the comment section on today's show.
At our website, you can also sign up for the free online newsletter or the free podcast of the show. You can also listen to it at iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you subscribe. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening. Please join us again next week.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to The People's Pharmacy.
These days, work is in trouble. We've outsourced most of our manufacturing to other countries. And with that, we sent away good jobs and our capability to make things. American Giant is a clothing company that's pushing back against this tide. They make all kinds of high-quality clothing and activewear, like sweatshirts, jeans, dresses, jackets, and so much more, right here in the USA. So when you buy American Giant, you create jobs in towns and cities across the country. And jobs bring pride, purpose. They stitch people together. If all that sounds good to you, visit American-Giant.com and get 20% off your first order when you use code STAPLE20 at checkout. That's 20% off your first order at American-Giant.com with promo code STAPLE20.